Why are we not using cattle as money, or salt, or seashells? That is the question we want to deal with in part 2 of the series, Understanding the Potential of Bitcoin according to Dr. Saifedean Ammous. And of course, we're talking about this book, The Bitcoin Standard, and we're trying to understand the themes, the concepts, the ideas in this book in order to understand Bitcoin and its potential, its value, and its future. Right now we're talking about primitive monies, chapter 2, and it's very interesting because in this chapter Dr. Ammous actually fleshes out and contextualizes all the ideas he proposed in chapter 1 about money. So he gives some historical examples, and I found that very helpful to understand what he's talking about, and it gets very concrete. So one big example he uses is the island of Yap. That's an island in Micronesia. And interestingly enough, they used stones as their money. They used so-called rice stones as money, and they used them because they were very scarce on the island of Yap. Actually, there were no rice stones on this island. They were carved out of limestones, and you had to get them from Palau or Guam, which were islands nearby, and you had to quarry them there, and then you had to transport them by canoe, and it was very, very difficult. So, because this money was very scarce and therefore a great store of value, and it would hold its value into the future, so there was a great salability across time, people used it as a medium of exchange. And when they had these stones in Yap, everybody knew, all right, this is the owner of this stone, and word spread, and they could actually make business with these stones, and everybody knew what was going on until 1871, when an Irish-American captain named David O'Keefe was shipwrecked on the shores of Yap, which is very interesting. So there was this guy, and he was shipwrecked on the shores of Yap, and he found out, all right, they have something of value, which is coconuts. So maybe I can export some coconuts and sell them to people who want coconut oil or whatever, but how can I pay those guys? And he actually realized, all right, they're using these rice stones. Maybe I can pay them in rice stones. And what he did, because he had a ship, is it was very easy for him to drive back and forth between Palau and Yap. And also he was more technologically advanced, so he used some explosives and modern tools to quarry several large rice stones. And so he had, like, all of a sudden this advantage, and he could actually, before the stock flow ratio of rice stones in Yap was very high, which is a good indicator of hard money. So it was very difficult to increase the supply, and the stock already there was high as well. But all of a sudden he would be able to increase the supply a lot because of technological advance. And so he brought these Yap stones, and interestingly enough, in the beginning the chiefs actually didn't want that. They said, hey, this is not the same way we do it, and therefore it's not. They had a sense that this is changing something, because he's actually not having to work really hard for these rice stones. He was just using some explosives. So they said, this is not the same way we do it. But then, of course, there were some people who said, well, it's rice stones, so we're just going to use them, and please take our coconuts. We take some of the rice stones instead. So what happened, by more and more rice stones flooding the island, of course the stock flow ratio actually declined. It was lower, and therefore the hardness of money evaporated, and it became more and more easy money. And when something is easy money, everybody loses, because everybody who puts their value into it has less after a certain amount of time. So it didn't take a long time until they found a new form of money, because it didn't really make sense anymore. Something similar happened with the so-called agri-beads or glass beads in Western Africa, which was interesting because those glass beads, there weren't a lot of glass factories in Africa, so there weren't a lot of glass beads lying around. So people, because they were scarce, people used them as money. And then this was actually, let me see, I think it was in the 16th century, so it was a long time ago. But they used these glass beads as money, and as we learned in the chapter beforehand, what is really important about money is its salability across space. So you need to be able to transport it well, which was easy with glass beads, right? Then you need to have salability across time, so that is, it needs to hold its value, which means when you have this good, which you use as a monetary device, and you use it in 10 years, it has to have it has to have the same amount of value or even more. So that's the salability across time, and which that was easy with glass beads because they couldn't produce a lot, they didn't have a lot, so it was scarce, and therefore it was a good holder of value. And the third one is, of course, this salability across scales. So you need to be able to divide the units, so you can actually buy small things and buy big things, and that was easy with these glass beads as well. Which one thing that was really difficult about the glass beads was that they were not uniform, so you couldn't really use them really easily as a unit of account because they were not very easily comparable, because some were big, some were small, some were more expensive, so you had not really well-defined units of glass beads, but you could still use them as medium of exchange, and you could use them as a store of value. So what happened is, in the 16th century, some European explorers came to Western Africa, and they realized, oh, they're using these glass beads, but we in Europe, we're actually technologically more advanced already, and we have a lot of glass factories. We actually have a lot of glass beads, therefore we can just import them to Western Africa and buy stuff for cheap, because our price of production of glass beads is lower than what we get in Western Africa for the same amount of glass beads. So they packed whole ships of glass beads full, traveled to Western Africa, and slowly started buying stuff in Africa, more and more and more. And what is different than the story from the Yap Island is, in Yap Island it was pretty much more, it was pretty much sudden, the change from going away from rice stones to other things, because everybody realized, all right, this is not valuable anymore. In Western Africa, the process was slower and therefore a lot more dangerous. Why is that the case? Because what happens is, more and more people realize, well, my glass beads, they don't have the same buying power anymore, but I don't really know why. There just seems to be more glass beads around, but it goes slow and slow and slow. So if somebody has actually saved a lot of his production value in this glass beads and wants to transfer this wealth in the future for his family or whatever, he would slowly lose value. So a lot of his actually hard work value would deteriorate over time. And that is what happened more and more and more. And so these people would impoverish. They would get poor. Although they actually had done everything right, they invested their money in this form of store of value that they have, these glass beads, but because the production all of a sudden increased through all these Europeans, it got less valuable and less valuable. And Dr. Ammous writes that this will be very interesting to think about when we later talk about government money and how the savers actually lose when hard money becomes easy money. So because they lose the value, the wealth goes down for all the ones who had wealth and invested it in this store of value. So this is a really interesting example of people slowly impoverishing, and there was a big winner. And the winner were the producers of glass beads, because they could just up the production, more and more and more ships coming, and they bought more and more stuff from Western Africa, from the people there. And it was interesting because in the end it went that far that these glass beads were called slave beads, because people bought so much stuff from Africans that a lot of Africans didn't have anything left, and they would start selling themselves, or they were being sold. And so these glass beads became something very, very haunting and yeah, sad actually, in historically looking back what happened there. So one more example is seashells. Seashells were used as money, and of course again we have the salability across scales. You can divide them well. You have the salability across space. You can transport them well, and you have the salability across time, because seashells were very rare in a lot of different areas. For example, in Northern America, a lot of Native Americans used them, or in parts of Africa and Asia. And these, for example, one seashell that was used was called wampum. And I find it interesting that, again, when the harvest of seashells from the sea actually became a lot easier through technological advance, the production could be increased, and therefore they lost their value again. So I think, if you think about it, there was a time when people didn't have bills in their wallets, but they actually had like seashells, bags of seashells, or bags of glass beads, or bags of rice stones. So it doesn't really matter what we use as money. It just needs to solve the essential problems that we need for our transfer of value, for our business system. And it doesn't really matter what it is. So that's really, really interesting when you think about it. But as with glass beads, as with rice stones, the same thing happened with seashells, because it got more and more easy to harvest them, and the boats got bigger and the technology advanced, and so they lost their value. And of course, more and more of metal coins started arising because they were more uniform. The seashells had the same problem as the glass beads, that they weren't really uniform, so there was not a lot of room for specialization in the economy. And also because if you don't have specialization, that means you can't really compare the different values, you can't calculate, you can't start building a big economy. And that was the case with these monetary systems. So people realized more and more that metal coins have a lot of stability, and they are of course very uniform. You can divide them up into very equal portions. One more example he shows is how people used cattle as money, where you can easily transport it. It holds its value over time, because a cattle is always valuable for nutritional purposes. But of course, it's very difficult to transfer it across scales. It's hard to divide it down. It's hard to carry it around. And therefore, people used salt as well for a medium of exchange, because that was easily transportable. And something interesting, the English word celery actually comes from the Latin word sal, which is salt. So you still have this reminiscent roots in our language. And also pecuniary is derived from pecus, and that is the Latin word for cattle. So still in our language we can see some of that. These are the main points in chapter 2 about primitive monies, and they flesh out the idea that scarcity is key for anything that was used as money and anything that was dispensed and got exchanged or lost its value because it wasn't scarce anymore. And there are many examples, and I find it very helpful to look at these examples. And of course, one can understand how big technological advances influence what kind of money is used or is dropped. And the hydrocarbon fuel development changed a lot, because you could query a lot of things faster, you could dig deeper, you had bigger boats, you could so a lot of things that used to be scarce weren't that scarce anymore when you could actually use fuel in order to use a machine and get that stuff out. I hope these ideas help a little to flesh out the concepts of chapter 1. They were very helpful to me. And in the next chapter is the big step to then the metal coins, gold, silver, all of that stuff. And slowly we're starting to understand why Bitcoin plays a very, very interesting role in this whole process.